So I want to take you through some of the conceptual ideas. If I'd had more time, I was planning to say something about the India-Pakistan relationship in particular, and that's indeed the subject of the workshop on Thursday. And indeed, we'll be running a role-play crisis simulation in that workshop. But today, I want to sort of just talk about some of the conceptual issues that arise in thinking about this question. And we talked in the previous session about some of the ways in which identities get established and issues of how enmity gets produced and reproduced. And what I'm interested in is how we break down the barriers to trust, how we break down distrust and build new trusting relationships. So what I want to do in the time I have available, the question really that's driving me here is how important is trust in transforming enemy images? And I'll say something about enemy images as we go along. So first of all, I want to look at what is trust. I mean, the general view in international relations, of course, is that those that come from a realist persuasion, it's very much the view that trust is impossible in relationships between states. John Mearsheimer's famous phrase in his 2001 book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, there's no room for trust in a world of states. And my argument's very much designed to challenge that. Although I think Mearsheimer's onto some important points, I think the conclusions he generates are ultimately unsatisfactory, both from an analytical and indeed from a normative point of view. So I want to say something about enemy images, how they get established, and then I want to talk about some approaches to how we might break down enemy images, two here, both of which I think ultimately have real problems. The first one is, some of you may be familiar with this, it's the idea associated with Charles Osgood, the social psychologist in the US, called GRIT, Graduated Reciprocation Intention Reduction. The second one is associated with rationalist sort of thinking about international relations. Those of you familiar with the work of Andrew Kidd and this idea of costly signaling. Then I want to offer my own theory, which is the idea that interpersonal interaction at the highest levels of diplomacy, I kind of mentioned that briefly in my question in the previous session, that's a missing dimension of trust building. And I want to say something about that, and then finally some concluding thoughts. So that's what I want to do. First of all, then, what's trust? Well, we could spend a whole workshop, we could spend a whole year, we could spend a whole lifetime with the question, what is trust? As I say, for me, the really interesting question is, we all have an idea of what trust is, but based on that idea, do we think it really applies at the international level? Or is there something about the international domain which means it's just not a place where you can talk about trust? My own university is associated in its founding with the Chamberlain family. And of course, everyone remembers Neville Chamberlain going to Munich in 1938, coming back, waving the piece of paper as he got off of the aeroplane, peace in our time. And there's always the danger, of course, that we might trust the wrong people. And indeed, when I say it's really important to understand the concept of trust in international relations, it's very important that we only trust the trustworthy. But of course, deciding who is the trustworthy is the fundamental challenge. So a cross-disciplinary definition from management here that's very widely cited in the literature on trust research is that trust is a psychological state that comprises this intention to accept vulnerability based upon positive expectations. Now, the point here, of course, is that we don't take on vulnerability, and indeed I think I argue in my book that there's a real problem with this formulation. We don't take on vulnerability, of course, because we expect in any way to be betrayed. The whole point about trust is that the expectation is that we aren't actually taking on vulnerability. Even though in some existential sense, if you want, objectively, others who aren't part of that trusting relationship might say, whoa, you really are taking on vulnerability by trusting that person. But you yourself, you don't feel at all that you're taking on any vulnerability. So it is, I think even Rousseau's definition, which is widely cited, contains within it some problems. But that's kind of what a lot of people talk about in the literature as trust. So it's a mental state that's derived from beliefs about the trustworthiness of others. And the relationship between trust and trustworthiness is a really important part of this story. Of course, it's a mental state that makes possible, enables, if you want, behaviors that otherwise would not be possible. And this is where the conflict reduction element of my work comes in. I'm interested in if we have decision makers holding these kind of mental, with these kind of mental states, what are the possibilities in terms of conflict reduction that wouldn't otherwise be there? So in order to make a judgment about the trustworthiness of others, I talk about 3 dimensions of trustworthiness, which you find in the literature, but these aren't always put together in the way I've done this here. So first of all, we look for benign intent. So there's something about intentions, and of course we spend a lot of time in international relations talking about intentions. But I'm talking here about the intentions between, and this of course is a really big question, about the agents of trust. Who are the actual agents of trust? Some people want to argue that states can be the agents of trust, so we can talk about India trusting Pakistan. I think that's a problematic move. I want to talk about leaders, so that kind of fits very much with a sort of psychological approach. But leaders, of course, who are not, they're leaders who hold particular offices at those times when they're in those roles, so they're always acting on behalf of states. So we can, if we want, we can talk about an individual, and I'll talk about later an interpersonal dimension of state behavior, but we are dealing not with individuals who are individuals, we're dealing with individuals who represent something called the state. And so when we talk about agents, I think we have to be careful about how we're doing this, because when we talk about Reagan and Gorbachev, for example, which is one of my case studies in my book, clearly it's only important that Reagan and Gorbachev, their relationship, when they are the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union. What Gorbachev writes today may be of historic interest, it may be interesting to hear what he's got to say, but he's no longer representing what then was the Soviet state. The second dimension of trustworthiness is integrity. It's fundamentally important that if I have an opportunity to exploit you or to defect from our arrangements, I don't do that, because I value the relationship that we have. And rationalist models of trust can't capture this idea of integrity, because of course they're only interested in how we maximize our utility and cost-benefit analysis. So the second dimension of trustworthiness is integrity. And the third is, and this is often overlooked, but really interesting I think, is the capacity to deliver. It's no good trusting someone if they can't deliver. So you can trust Obama on the Iran deal, the Iranians can trust Obama, but if Obama can't make it stick at home domestically, then that's not going to be good for them. Or the other way around, Obama can trust Rouhani and Zarif that they've got benign intent towards them, that they've got integrity, but if they can't deliver it, because Khamenei, the supreme leader, is ultimately going to block this, then, I'm just using this as an example, as a potential example, then that's going to be a real problem. And in my book, I show how that problem of capacity to deliver fundamentally thwarted the really interesting peace process that developed between Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Nawaz Sharif through the Lahore summit. In the end, Sharif, I think, did have benign intent and integrity, debatable, controversial, make a lot of argument in my book about this, but ultimately he couldn't carry Pakistan, in particular the army, of course, with him. And so Vajpayee's trust in Sharif at Lahore proved to be misplaced in terms of capacity, but I would argue ultimately that Sharif didn't betray him, but we can pick that up maybe in the Q&A. Okay, so that's trust. The question is, can it break down enemy... Sorry, that's not trust. You can come back in questions. Can it break down enemy images? So what's an enemy image? So an enemy image is a belief on the part of decision makers that another state has malign intent, and crucially is beyond policies of reassurance. All states, and this comes back to the point you were making, Katerina, about insecurity, all states in the sense of insecure, if we start from the premise that it's a condition of international anarchy, the absence of a global authority, kind of international relations 101. But the crucial question is, can they be reassured? Kissinger said if a state can't be reassured, then that's when it becomes what he called a revolutionary power. So an enemy image is the belief on the part of a set of decision makers that another state has got malign intent towards you, it's exhibited in its behavior, that malign intent, and it's beyond policies of reassurance. I'm going to have to speed up significantly. Okay, so this can give rise to what Ole Holstein in 1967 in a fantastic article, and then a chapter in a book, Enemies in Politics, with two other people, called An Inherent Bad Faith Model. An inherent bad faith model is where you believe that the adversary's behavior is driven by inherent characteristics. Ken Booth and I, in our book, in the 2008 book, we call this ideological fundamentalism. What's crucial in political psychology terms, of course, is that behavior is driven by dispositional traits rather than by situational variables. And of course, we know this from attribution theory. And I don't need to labor that point in this audience. So what are the implications of a bad faith model? The implications are, of course, and this is crucial to my argument about how we build trust, is that the actors will discount any conciliatory move. Because even if that move is genuine on the part of the actor that's making that move, it will be interpreted as either a trick or, crucially, a sign of weakness. And if you're making moves in a context of a bad faith model out of weakness, then that's going to vindicate me in my view that the reason why you're making those moves is because I was strong. And so I need to stay strong in order to continue to get you to make conciliatory moves. And we saw that logic with the Iranian-US interaction, and indeed with the Israeli perception of that story, which was Obama needed to keep turning the screw on the Iranians to get a better deal. And indeed, many people who are critical of the deal argue that they gave in too easily, and that if only they'd gone and pursued more coercion, they would have got a better deal. Or not, in my view, no deal at all, but that's the argument. So now I'm not saying that sometimes a bad faith model isn't justified. The question is, when is it justified, and when is it going to lead to an increase in hostility and security competition, which could have been avoided if we'd shown greater awareness and sensitivity to the security concerns of others. So I want to talk about two psychological drivers that I think produce and reproduce enemy images. The first is what I call peaceful defensive self-images. This is the inability to put ourselves in the shoes of others and to understand that our own actions might be seen as fearful and threatening. So this is the problem of a lack of empathy, because we have to recognize that others have legitimate security fears and that their own actions might have contributed to the others' insecurity. Now, knowing when to exercise empathy and when to exercise deterrence and coercion, of course, is the fundamental problem of the security dilemma. The security dilemma, for me, I always define it as the existential condition of uncertainty that confronts actors about the motives and intentions of others with the military capability to harm us. So, the question is, what can we do to get out of these kind of dynamics? So we've got psychological drivers of peaceful defensive self-images, and the other psychological driver is this ideological fundamentalism and bad faith model. And those two psychological drivers together drive security competition between two states that have peaceful intentions but are unable to signal that to the other. This is the problem of signaling type that US security dilemma theorists talk about. So what can we do to break through that cycle of security competition and hostility in such a way as to enable each side to communicate to the other that they do have peaceful intentions? So is that possible? Where Mearsheimer and I fundamentally disagree is that someone like Mearsheimer would say that ultimately states can never signal their type. There's no set of policies that states can use in order to signal their peaceful intentions. And that's why you have to assume the worst, because you just don't know whether the other state has got peaceful or malign intent, because there's no way of signaling. So the question is, are there ways of signaling your type? And if so, how important is trust in that story? So the first argument I want to look at is this argument about grit. How many people in the room know Osgood's model of grit? Not too many. Okay, right. So basically, he wrote this book 9 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis. American social psychologist, very concerned about the United States and the Soviet Union moving into a relationship of such hostility and enemy imaging that they were going to end up in a nuclear crisis and ultimately maybe even a nuclear war. So he argued that to break through it, you need one side to make the first move, but it needs to be a publicly announced unilateral gesture. Now, what he had in mind here was small conciliatory moves. He wasn't talking about something really bold and dramatic. He was talking about small, low-level, low-risk moves. And what you do is you invite reciprocation from the other party. Now, where he broke ground with many other people, and indeed subsequently, was he said, if you don't get reciprocation immediately, you don't give up. So what you do instead is you say, okay, maybe they're running a bad faith model. So what we need to do is try and break that down. So let's make some more small moves. He said you only retaliate if they exploit you. So in prisoner's dilemma terms, you would only respond negatively if you were dealing with a defection. But if they don't defect against you and exploit your move, but they don't reciprocate it, then you carry on. And if reciprocation then develops, you then, he said, what then happens is a spiral of trust, he called it, develops. And then, and this is crucial, bolder signals can then be sent. So if we get reciprocation, we then go to bolder signals. Now, there's a couple of fundamental problems with this. First of all, how are you going to legitimate domestically watching the other side pocket your concessions? So, you know, they haven't responded in a negative way, but neither have they reciprocated. So are you going to be able to justify domestically having made that kind of move? That's very hard. There's no historical evidence of that happening over a period of time. No case of that, as far as I'm aware. And the other problem is, will the limited moves be enough to change the other side's enemy image? If they're only limited moves, and the other side's running this bad faith model, then how are those other moves going to fundamentally break it down? Because they could be dismissed as tokenistic, or indeed as a trick, or a sign of weakness. So it's very hard to see how that's going to get us out of it. And the problem is, if you do get reciprocation, to move to a bolder move, you've got to then believe that you'd get reciprocation at that level. But where's the trust coming from to enable you to then go to the next level? And so I don't think grit contains within it the causal mechanism to build trust in such a way that two adversaries can break out of the problem that I've identified. I think it's a really interesting idea. I think more people should be aware of it. I think there's some really interesting research to be done around it. It's been applied in a number of cases. People tried to apply it to Gorbachev's initiatives, but there's a problem with that, which I can pick up in Q&A. And I've given the example there of Obama, and again, I don't have time to go into this. But interestingly, Obama made one move, what Trita Parsi called a single roll of the dice, and then when Khamenei didn't immediately reciprocate it, Obama stopped. There were no more significant US conciliatory moves, and Khamenei arguably didn't respond because he didn't feel it was sufficiently significant. So if grit doesn't get us where we want to get, what about this idea of costly signals? So this comes out of the rationalist tradition, and it's an approach to reassurance. It's based on the idea of dramatic signals that are aimed at breaking down the enemy images of decision makers by signaling a state's type. So we're looking for something bigger here. So now, an example of this, for example, would be Sadat's decision in November 1977 to go to Jerusalem and publicly recognize Israel before the Knesset. That's a dramatic move that's aimed at signaling a state's type. Now, many people argue that Vajpayee's decision to go to Lahore can be seen in the same way. Rajesh Bajra makes that argument. I think there are problems with both of those, but they're often used in the literature as cases of it. So the key thing about a costly signal is that it's one I wouldn't send if I had malign intent. So a really good example, I think, is December 1988. Gorbachev announced that he was going to take away all of the short warning surprise attack capabilities that were on then the central front between what was then West Germany and East Germany, part of the Cold War. And those capabilities really worried NATO planners, because once those capabilities were stripped away, the Soviet Union wouldn't have had a capability for a short warning surprise attack against NATO. So that was a big signal, because Gorbachev had he implemented that decision, I mean, subsequent events, the East European revolutions, the end of the Cold War, meant that we didn't go into that period. But had they been implemented, NATO's security dilemma would have been transformed. So what you're trying to do, cost is an odd word in this language, and it's sometimes used, for those of you that are familiar with rationalist literature in IR, it's often used to refer to audience costs and issues around that, which I can pick up if you want in Q&A. But the key thing about it is you're looking for a signal that unambiguously signals your type. So, so the question is, why I think this approach is really interesting is, Andrew Kidd, who's most prominently associated with it, argues that these costly signals, these bold moves, only come about when the actors have already developed trust. So for Kidd, this costly signal depends upon a certain level of trust. And indeed, you can only get a really costly signal when you've got a high level of trust. Now, Kidd thinks that actors develop that trust through reciprocated cooperation, so it picks up the kind of the grit argument. But again, I think, as with grit, he doesn't explain satisfactorily, and neither do others who work in this genre, how the trust actually develops. Because to say that we get some very low-level cooperation on certain issues, again, we come back to that problem. What's going to make me get on the plane and go to Jerusalem and make such a dramatic step? So where does the trust come from to make those bold moves possible? Or do you want to argue that ultimately it's the bold moves that build the trust? So then we're asking decision makers to make the bold moves in the absence of trust, in the belief that that will then bring it about. But how many decision makers really are willing to make those kind of bold moves in the absence of trust? And if you say, no, okay, there has to be a level of trust before we're going to really make those bold moves, then the question is, where does the trust come from? So what I argue in my book is that we don't have an adequate theory of how trust gets built between enemies. And what we need is to think about additional causal mechanisms. And what I argue is that one possible causal mechanism, one important causal mechanism, is what I call interpersonal bonding trust. Now, Teresa and I have just put in for a major grant with a couple of colleagues to explore the idea of what we call the interpersonal domain of interaction. And what we're interested in is, what are the potentialities of interpersonal interaction at the highest levels of diplomacy? What possibilities open up when decision makers interact face to face? Security dilemma sensibility is an idea that I develop in my earlier